Welcome to this new episode of Terms of Engagement. We've been discussing the making and the functioning of the Indian Republic in this series of interviews with scholars. Our guest today is Sandipto Dasgupta, who is Assistant Professor of Politics at the New School of Social Research in New York. His research is in the history of modern political and social thought, especially the political theory of empire, decolonization, and postcolonial presence. He is the author of Legalizing the Revolution, India and the Constitution of the Post-Colony. Sandipto argues in this book that the makers of Indian Constitution sought to preempt a popular insurrection, a revolution, by building a democratic process that was also committed to social and economic transformation. Why and how was that model conceived, and how is it going 7 decades on? I discuss these questions and more with Sandipto. Welcome to the Hindu Terms of Engagement series, Sandipto.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Right. Legalizing the Revolution, that's a title. Could you explain what do you mean?
Well, the idea, I think, generally when we think about constitutions, right, the idea is that there is a revolution which happens, changes things, brings a new regime, and then you have a constitution, right, which sort of then, is about preserving the sort of original vision of that regime. And I want to say that in India, and I would say more broadly, countries which won their independence in sort of mid 20th century, in Asia and Africa, the idea was a bit different. It was to have a constitution which can facilitate kind of a planned, controlled transformation, which we often know as development, planning. Um, so it's in other words, the constitution came not after a revolution, but before that. And the revolution, in some senses, the idea was to legalize it and see if we can use law and legal terms and juridical instruments to facilitate a revolution, and which I argue is quite distinct in the history of constitutions.
Right. So, though it may not have been a revolution in some senses, one could actually think of Indian national movement as a revolution, and at the conclusion of it, when the founding by Ambedkar that you quote, he says that, okay, there is no longer a place for civil disobedience because now you have a government
Right.
of your own. So, was it also at some level the conclusion of a revolution and the beginning of a new order?
So, at some levels, you can obviously say, yes, it was a very important change. And I don't want to sort of, minimize the importance of going from British Empire to Indian Republic. What I want to say is that, if it's always interesting to me, and it's very early on, even when we study in school, right? We never use the word revolution or revolutionaries to talk about independence, talked about, independence movement, independence struggle. And when we say revolutionary or say Krantikari in Hindi, which is about a particular kinds of figures, the Bhagat Singh and some other figures, who are in the margins, right? And the Congress often sort of says that we are not those figures. There's separation between us and the revolutionaries. So it's kind of always interesting to me that the figures themselves throughout the 50, 60 years of Indian independence movement, the height of it, never even once called themselves revolutionaries, right? And that's what's to me kind of interesting. But more than that, what they say, I think the point I was making is, and which is you get from the Constituent Assembly debates, which I look at, where they try to sort of define the phrase revolution. What they mean that they are not, why it's not a revolution, is that they understand revolution as disruptive, as unpredictable. So you can think of the French, the Russian Revolution, where things suddenly kind of change very quickly. You can't really control the events. There is somewhat of violence, right? There's like, things rise and fall very quickly. And that's the kind of disruptive process, right? Disruptive, uncertain process, kind of, where sort of this huge mass mobilization is what I think they wanted to avoid, actually, both, before and under. I think that the closest India came to that was the Quit India movement, where I think you could see that sort of, because the Congress leaders were jailed early on, you could see this kind of spontaneous, unpredictable, often violent mass mobilization, right? And I think that's the path they want to avoid. So they want the social change, but they want to avoid that process, which I think accompanies all revolutions in their mind.
So that idea, a kind of ambiguous relationship with the popular mobilization and social change, that remains a continuing characteristic of Indian politics during national movement, in the making of the constitution, and subsequently.
Yes, yes. In the sense that it's a very interesting relationship with the people, which I think also you're very right to point out that actually there is a similarity from before and after independence, which is on what level you really need the people. The reason Congress is Congress, the reason they can claim to be the next governor or claim to negotiate with the British on equal terms is because they have the people on their side. It's a genuine mass party, as we know, right? There's large membership. It has an office in every district, mirroring the British administration. It is arguably the largest mass party in history. So it's a popular party. It has popular support, and because it has popular support is why it's a serious party, right? That's why the British take them seriously. That's why they are actually claiming power. So, in other words, they depend on the people. There's a really need and dependence on the popular politics. At the very same time, popular politics everywhere in history has a tendency to radicalize and go beyond what the leaders themselves want, right? And in the case of India, this was to do with, for example, land agitation, peasant agitations against landlords who are Indian, who are not British, right? So, or worker movements against strikes against Indian industrialists. And so these are the kinds of, and there was a much more bigger sort of horizon of demands than just the focused one on the British government, right? And that starts to happen. And as the independence movement goes on, especially in the 30s and the 40s, this becomes more and more radicalized. And that creates anxiety in the minds of some Congress leaders, and then eventually all of them. But to begin with, people like Patel or Rajaji find this to be somewhat problematic, right? And so I think, and then so the Congress have this simultaneous dependence on, but an anxiety about the people, right? And I think that dynamic. So in other words, it's not undemocratic because they don't say that no, the people have no role. On the other hand, it also has this weariness about popular politics, right? I think this particular dynamic shapes the constitution. And if you think about after independence, you're right in the sense that India is a democracy in the sense parties have to make a popular claim. They have to go to the people to win an election. But at the same time, they're not very democratic internally, right? They don't allow for big popular participation or major kind of changes, popular demands to seep up, right? And so I think this simultaneous dependence and anxiety about popular politics, popular mobilization, right, is quite a significant element, I would argue, for the constitution making process, but also the institutional design which follows it.
Right. In fact, they were in a way justified, or actually the immediate circumstances of the making of the constitution, particularly partition violence, perhaps
Right.
justifies their fear or skepticism about mass mobilization.
So that's a lot of people made that argument actually, and I think there's some logic to that. Of course, I mean, if you know the extent and the horror of the partition violence, right, which is in some sense a popular violence, spontaneous people sort of organizing and committing those acts. But the counter argument which I want to make there is that the anxiety that is begins much before that, and I think it really begins with the elections, the first elections that Congress fights, right, in the 30s, which is that's the first election they fight and the office acceptance after that election, right? And sort of the shift of the Congress from a popular party to the party of government in waiting. And many of these sort of demands, for example, to have elected constituent assembly, right? Or to have certain kind of representation of worker and peasant groups in Congress. All of these kind of demands would sort of, in some way give a larger and more important space to popular politics, right? Is sort of we start to see that being distanced from that time onwards, right? Including the fact of whether or not Congress should accept office or work with the bureaucrats and the police, which was repressing them till yesterday. So I would argue that shift is not just to do with the partition. And in some senses, I would go further and argue that partition is some sense an effect of that, right? The fact that you suddenly have a division of a country where the people are at no point consulted, right? It's done entirely at the governmental level, right? And even the Constitution of India's geography, like all the treaties with the princes, the partition is done entirely at the centralized level, right? With no popular participation. So I think in some senses you can see that actually happens, the shift from popular politics happens before that rather than after that.
Right. So when at the inauguration of the constitution, they are making it very clear that now that we have this constitution, which embodies our collective vision for the future,
Right.
this becomes the framework for change, participation,
Right.
representation. For all that thing, you just look into this document. That is argument that is being made at the beginning of
Yeah. What it's saying is basically that we understand the need for change. We understand that even if we have political freedom, there is massive social and economic challenges and inequalities. There is therefore a kind of a yearning amongst the masses, as they say, for change, substantive change in the socio-economic condition, not just the political rule. But we will take care of that. We will do that on our own terms through a kind of a peaceful process, calm, deliberate, controlled, slow process. That is planning, right? Uh, what we don't want to happen, and we will not allow, is any kinds of demands for change or kind of agitations outside these frameworks, right? And so there's this kind of thing of, okay, now either you come within this framework and talk to us, and we'll negotiate among different parties and do something about it, or we repress you if you're going to go outside, right? There is no way you can make an agitation outside those frameworks, which is a pretty big shift from the independence movement, of course, which was often, deliberately outside those frameworks. The whole kind of, contribution of the Gandhian politics was, as Gandhi says, we can't just be in councils and, assemblies and write petitions. We have to do this big mass demonstrations outside and break the law, all of those things. Those things now become sidelined, right? And all the demands for change has to be processed through this institutional structure, which we have built.
And then they are proposing that we have to spread constitutional morality. Could you explain that concept? Yeah.
So the constitutional morality is, I think, it's a very important term. It's used by Ambedkar, and he takes it from this sort of British liberal thinkers. And the understanding of that is that the meaning of that really is that people have to, like the common people, have to learn this particular language of politics, right? And in some senses, leave that other language of politics, which they knew during independence movement, which is really about sort of this kind of mass demonstrations and protests and targeted law breaking and so on, and learn this new language, right? And that's really what I think it means, that like there's a kind of a new grammar in how we make political demands, and it's important that we learn that, and also important that we forget the other one.
So at the beginning, so therefore they are suggesting so that a two-way track to future imagining of the post-colonial republic,
Right.
which is that you have transformation both in economic and social sphere that would be coming, and on the other hand you have a democratic process, parliamentary process that will actually these two streams will mutually reinforce as we go along.
Right.
That was the imagination, right?
Right. And I think I want to make the point there, which is that I think it was quite a new thing. Because if you look at history, whenever you have the project of big state-led transformation, let's say Bismarck in Germany or Stalin in Soviet Union, is generally very centralized and very much driven by the executive, right? So executive sort of drives. I think what was quite amazing in the Indian context that they wanted to be a parliamentary process of change, right? In other words, because normally parliaments are not seen the best instrument for that, because there's too many parties, there's too much conversation, you don't get. But actually, the Indian constitution makers understood that for a country like India, you need that, right? You cannot have this one all-powerful president, right? Who kind of, that is the reason why they considered and rejected the idea of an elected president, right? They didn't want there to be an elected, centralized executive figure. They wanted it to run through the parliament, where there is this kind of institutional kind of motivation for negotiation, for bargaining, for all the voices to be heard. And this was the idea that parliament could therefore becomes a venue, and then that sort of funnels it up, and it works with the technocrats, the planners, to kind of combine together. So bring the politics from the parliamentary side and the expertise from the technocratic side, and they come together, and we produce this thing which will be a democratic idea of transformation. That was the idea. Whether that works out or not is a different question, but I think
So
in some senses
you argue that that is not quite the way it progressed.
doesn't work out that way. And I think we can see that in some way today, like the role of the parliament. And this has not happened today. This happened from the time of, I can say, Indira Gandhi, but even maybe before in the later Jawaharlal Nehru years, the importance of prime minister and the prime minister's office, and that as kind of a quasi presidency, And the role of the parliament, you see throughout Indian history, has kind of weakened. So in the early parliaments, you had extensive debates about that. The parliamentary commission had enormous power. And that has to that parliament now is just the place you just quickly vote and move on, right? And I think that, to me, that's a decline in some senses of democratic processes. So the sidelining of parliament and moving much more towards the kind of this more presidential idea of the prime minister or the cabinet as the supreme body.
Right. So, even while we very consciously avoided a presidential form of government, the planning commission or the idea of centralized planning was very central to the transformation that we are trying to attempt.
Absolutely. So the planning thing, at that time, it's important to understand that people often think planning and they say, oh, socialism. Planning, everybody had a plan, right? There's a Marshall Plan, there's a Beveridge Plan, like everybody had a plan. And that's the thing which you do in the 1950s, right? So, and every other country had one. And the planning, much more than the ideological part of planning, what was important, I think, planning is this notion that we can make major social changes without political conflict, right? So planners are by nature not mentally political figures. They're experts. They can give us the best way to get economic growth, to create industrialization, to increase productivity. And then the parliament brings the political side to it and gives political backing, and they work together. But the planning process is this idea that we can now separate the process of social change from politics, which was the original premise, right? Because if you bring it together, then you get a social revolution. Then you get unrest, you get conflict. We don't want that. So planning is a way we can do it we can do social change without politics. And as I argue in the book, that also is not a sustainable idea. And then I think the planning commission members themselves, I quote, say, PC Mahalanobis, one of the most famous planning commission chairman in Indian history, right later on in the 60s, that was a wrong assumption that you can have major social change without substantive political mobilization.
So that a kind of disconnect between expertise and popular opinion or popular perception or understand politics, that was also a kind of an inbuilt problem that we begin with.
Right. I think that's the original idea which I was saying, the original sort of dynamic is that, right? That we can sort of, separate. Now popular politics will primarily be about elections, right? That's where we have popular political expression. And then we have for the, like we don't have popular mobilization, we don't have kind of this, intensity in politics, which we had during the independence movement, but we have this 5-year elections, we choose some people, and then we kind of trust them to have the expertise to do these changes, right? So I think there's this separation, exactly as you're right, between the product of social change and popular politics.
In fact, you cite this uh, description of Jawaharlal Nehru as a gentle betrayer of the masses in this context. Could you explain that?
So that's not my term. That's a term by the famous American. Yes, and I like that term because the reason because Nehru was seen correctly during the independence struggle. He was seen as what's called the Congress left, and the left and right in Congress is not just this ideological question of socialism, capitalism. It really was how much do we go through mass movement versus how much do we go through administrative state processes, right? So Nehru, for example, argues for non-office, like to not accept office right after the victory. He argues for, he writes these things about, elected constituent assemblies. He's one of the major figures in Congress, especially after Bose leaves, who is sort of seen as the figure which is receptive to mass movements, to say unions, peasant movements, like popular movements. Uh, they see Nehru as their person within the Congress, right? He's also quite powerful within the Congress. And this is something important to understand. Nehru is not powerful institutionally. Within the party, Patel is much more powerful. But Nehru is by far the more popular person. He's the main campaigner for Congress from every election onwards since the 37, right? He is the much more popular figure because some of his policies are more popular. The left wing are more popular, right? So Nehru does have some level of political capital to spend. And he has friends like people like Jayaprakash Narayan, other like Congress socialists, who kind of urge him to sort of say, either push Congress more to the left or leave Congress and come to us, and we start a new socialist opposition to Congress together with you, right? Break up Congress and come with us. He refuses to do either, right? He refuses to, and he thinks that even when Congress has become, the internal party of Congress becomes progressively more towards the right and more friendly to, say, landlords, or that the government, he thinks that the expertise in government, with that he can still do major change, right? And so I think there's this sense of Nehru as this very interesting figure, somewhat a tragic figure, right? Who sort of knows the value of mass movement, so ideologically supports much more radical version of social change, right? Who has no sympathy for people like the landlords, right? Nevertheless, right, he's someone who, when it comes to the moment, never makes that decisive moves and leaves there, rather it sort of goes with the Congress move, which is more and more away from popular movement and popular demands and into some administrative order and and governmental logic, and so on, right? And things which see the lands like land reform and their sort of failure. Nevertheless, Nehru, who is a very much a champion of land reform, nevertheless never makes that decisive break, right? And that's then, this is sort of my reading, therefore, of Nehru as this kind of tragic figure who both kind of understands the problems of this, but never really acts decisively for that.
Right. So one of the reasons why he could not push it further, or maybe one of the results of his inability to push it, is what you call the dictatorship of property. What is happening
Right.
there?
So, the idea again was that, okay, we'll have the new government, this expert plan, and we go in, and because, just to begin with, any project of social change, economic change, requires some change in the allocation of property by definition, right? That's what change means. You have some, change in the allocation of property, like who gets what, who works for whom, things like that. The idea here is that we can have the exact right plan. This much land, allocation is good in these areas, and this would be more productive, etc. And then we can just go and do that, right? What we realize, on the other hand, is the landlords, right, are the most powerful figures in social level. They're not powerful not because they own land. They often run the whole economy of the villages. Right? They're often the money lenders. They have social power. They have private armies, right? And what happens is that instead of you coming from the top and like sort of taking away these landlords, these extremely powerful entrenched figures, the other way happens, which is that the landlords actually become elected officials, right? Because they are able to sort of transfer or translate their sort of local social power into electoral power, right? By mobilizing votes and winning. And they capture from the late 30s onwards, like for example, historians like Gyan Pandey has written about this very well, about how the Congress organization is slowly captured by the local landed figures, right? Who are and the local officials are
They also capture the electoral process.
electoral process, and by which first the state government, not the central government, that happens much later, but the state officials become. So what happens is you might have the best land reform plan, the best planning document, but when you go to the ground level, that's never possibly implemented or even can fully kind of do it, right? And we know all the stories about how all these acts are subverted in different ways in local level. And land is a local, in the sense it's a state subject, right? So it's kind of it's closer to the ground, and the laws are much more amenable to this kind of shift. So in other words, rather than the idea that you can make the best sort of laws and plans and they will go change property, it's the other way around. Property has enough power that it can bend laws and plans to its will, right? Then you can go and bend. And I think there is misunderstanding of property just as some kind of allocation rather than a source of power, real power, right? And you thought that it's just a number, it's a math of who owns what, but it's actually source of real power. And to counteract that, you need power, right? You just don't need ideas and rationality and good ideas and plans. You need actual power. And when you take the popular mob movements out of the question, right, there is no source of counterpower. And so what happens is, in other words, the property colonizes the state rather than state changing the property.
Right. So this two-way track, which is of electoral democracy and transformation, actually reinforcing each other. Actually,
Right.
you have a situation in which the previous entrenched social interest groups capture the electoral process itself and sort of reproduce that earlier social order using the new technique of elections and other things.
That's a very interesting thing, because the idea was what they thought was a very simple idea, which is that, okay, people don't have vote, most people don't have and most people have money, they will of course vote for these changes, right? So we'll actually have now this electoral support behind these plans, because that's what will happen, and then we can go and make the changes. Except what happens, as you rightly point out, which is that the social powers actually capture the electoral process. And now what happens is that earlier you were a landlord supported by the British government. You didn't have legitimacy. But now you're a landlord or a Raja who's also an MP. And actually now you have all those same powers, but with democratic legitimacy, right? And this is why you can see all the princely states become MPs right away, right? So earlier you were just kind of, British appointed rulers were ruling. And now you actually also democracy. Actually, in some sense, it entrenches it further rather than weaken it. I shouldn't sort of make it so simplistic. There are, of course, democracies are messy things, and there are some, in different states, in different forms, it happens. There's some weakening happens. There's a shift between old absentee landlords to actually large farmers. So you can think someone like a Charan Singh, like that's a more powerful figure. So there are internal some shift within the elites. It's also the question of caste. Much later on, there will be some major, kind of the rise of the middle castes with elections. So there are pretty significant shifts. But overall, the kind of level of transformation they imagined elections would open up doesn't happen.
Right. So, and the overall centralized modernizing project of Indian state was undermined by the factors that we discussed right now, which is local power structures at that point.
Right.
And then later on, when decades later, when the question, the development models themselves came into question about.
Right.
So there you describe that okay, there are two forces. One is the forces of globalization undermining state, and the forces of local arguments and local powers. Also, the promise of a modernizing state, transformational state, is undermined by these two forces acting from two different directions.
Right. So, I mean, again, this is a simple way of thinking about this is like the cultural forms of movies, right? So, if you see the movies in the 50s, there is this, something like Mother India, there is this sort of faith and hope that this new state that we have now, developmental state, will give us development, right? And once that stops happening, so from the 70s, 60s, 70s, right, you start having like discontents, and of course, the JP movement is a big example of that, but you start having in different levels. You can see, I was thinking the movies, the more dissident figures who have question authority, like wonder, did we actually get what we were promised? Did independence actually give us social change or economic freedom? And so I think you see that internal loss of legitimacy of this idea that we can do change within the constitution without conflict, starting in the 70s itself. I think there's a kind of a moment of crisis which happens in the 70s, and you see a major reconfiguration in Indian politics. Congress loses its hegemony, right? For the first time, it loses elections in the state. There's a fracturing which happens. All of this is because this original idea, this plan, is by that time legitimized. So that's on the one hand. But on the outside, is it right? For the mid 70s, of course, you have first the debt crisis, the global debt crisis, the oil shock. And so there's externally all these ideas of new kind of post-colonial developmentalism starts getting weakened. And then by the 80s, you have the World Bank loans, the IMF loans, and the opening of economies across the world, including in India, from basically, late Indira Gandhi, Rajiv Gandhi time, you start having this opening up, right? So there's both an internal kind of loss of legitimacy of this original idea that we'll do development and democracy without conflict, and then of course there's an external kind of pressure, which weakens the project of developmentalism generally, globally.
Right. So, though your book has features of I would say, disappointment, a tone of disappointment in what has been achieved, but you also end it on a note of hope and optimism, which is to say that okay, the popular mobilization will at some point be able to seek transformation of a different kind. That is what you're.
So I don't want to be super romantic about this, like, oh, people will come out. It doesn't happen. Politics is always more complicated. Any kind of big popular mobilization is very hard, as we know from recent history. It's very, very hard to organize, very hard to sustain against state power. But the point is, I think the point of hope is that I think we should look at our history, right? Correct. I would say with pride as a history of popular. We were the country with the largest mass mobilization for independence. It was true mass mobilization, which is why we kind of, remain a democracy, right? Because, it became a democracy, we remain a democracy because of the strength of this popular political tradition, right? It has at time to time sort of come back. I mentioned JP movement, but other times you've seen that happen. And there is, I think, there is, at least in Indian history, from its own history, there is this idea of, popular political participation, I think, and that I like to believe or remain optimistic is never completely forgotten, right? We never have had, thankfully, yet, some kind of an army rule or, complete, like, sort of, disavowal democracy. Even if Indian democracy has, I think, been weakened a lot. And I think sometimes we hope that, that democracy, or think that democracy has gone too far in India. I think it's the other way around. We actually have to kind of, learn from our own history of popular mobilization and say we never actually had democracy go all the way down below, right? And actually kind of realize the full potential and promise of this anti-colonial movement that we ourselves had, and the democratic promise of that, sort of the Gandhian movement, the mass movement. And I think if we can sort of remember that and draw from that, there definitely is, in my way, a hope to revive both, Indian democracy and more broadly in society.
So, Sandipto, in your words, you are hoping and calling for popular disruptive capacity and its expansion. It has to expand. That is what you do. And you also emphasize that this has to be an organized indiscipline. You have to be defined, but it cannot be anarchy.
Right. No, no. So this is actually not my, this is definition of, like, scholars of democracy, that but how do you measure democratization is not necessarily just in terms of how many elections you have. It's actually, can people demand change in a way which is disruptive to the, the functioning, and therefore can get real changes. So that's how democracy kind of moves forward. Think again, I mean, I would keep talking about the JP movement, even the anti-emergency movements, right? That kind of claims they made to have restored Indian democracy at that time, right? So yes, so that's, I think, how you measure democracy, because I think we tend to measure democracy precisely by how many elections, But I think there's something about more popular participation. And the second thing is, I think often we think of those participation as kind of spontaneous way. We go out, we do like a candle march, we like, but actually you need parties. You need parties, organized parties, as the way we have during the independence movement. Again, that's the history we can go back to, which is that we had massive popular participation, but it was not like people doing whatever they want wherever they want. There was an organization which kind of channeled this together, which sustained it, and including in popular movements. Say you go to jail, you need an organization which go and supports you, supports your family, continues the movement even if the leaders are taken away, right? And that's what we saw during the independence struggle. And something like that, what you call an organized popular politics, right? Neither do we want complete quiet, nor do we want just pure spontaneous disruptions, right? We need to have an organized, systematic, sustained kind of democratic demands, right? Which is what I think is our own history, and what we, I think, would need to learn from.
Right. So, near 75 years after independence, we are sorry, after the constitution rather. So we are, though the design or the effort was to preempt a revolution or a violent revolution through this organized gradual transformation. The limits or how that actually was derailed along the way because of the conflicts that we discussed is one aspect of it. But one could argue that the revolution was not really prevented. We perhaps are living through a revolution of a different kind, in the sense that you have an insurrection, a Hindutva revolution, if one could call that, which is actually taking mass mobilization, popular participation, popular sovereignty in a direction that may not have been conceived there, but revolution nevertheless.
I think that's a very good point. I think my initial reaction would have been to say that what the Hindutva politics is, because in the classical in history of these two movements, the revolution and then a reaction. And revolution was to sort of change the things, and the reaction wants to kind of reinforce what we have, right? And in some senses, this is a classic politics, conservative politics, the politics of reaction, to say that we shouldn't change, we reassert what we already have. And in this particular case, sort of caste and religion and genders, hierarchies, we should reassert them rather than have them change, right? So there's a structure of reaction, but you're also right, that would be too simplistic, because it has made quite significant changes, I think, in the way Indians understand themselves, how we, see ourselves as collectivity in our, representation in media and images. So I think it's too simplest to call it just a reaction. I think some have called it a counter revolution, people like Christoph Jaffrelot, and I think I find a lot of value in that, which is that it's sort of a reaction in some senses to a massive change. And counter revolution not just simply ever just go back to the past, they have their own sort of versions. So I think that's what I would say it is, because the reason it's not in that sense revolutionary, I would argue, because it doesn't disrupt existing power structures in society, right? It doesn't disrupt who has property, actually accentuate property towards, the very top. It doesn't disrupt, who has power in terms of caste or gender lines. So in other words, revolution by definition throughout history has been something which changes existing structures of power, right? And I don't see that happening with the rise of the BJP. I think it's in some ways it has made some interesting changes in how we understand politics, but nevertheless, so if you look at the underlying structures of power in society, it reinforces them rather than disrupt them.
Right. So, in not only in India, in most of post-colonial societies, and including in advanced democracies, we see a kind of we are going through a phase in which the idea of popular will and popular participation all are actually being debated, contested. It is no longer a straight line or a straight interpretation of what popular will mean. So in this context, you still remain optimistic. You do believe that there is possibility of transformational popular mobilization and participation.
I mean, it is. I think it's very hard for someone to look at Indian politics today objectively and say there's like optimism, right? So, um, but I think so. I won't say kind of more in a predictive sense. I don't know what will happen in the next 10 years, right? That's. But I think in a sort of structural sense, you would have to believe that there is always like that throughout history we have seen, right, there's never been a complete acquiescence to power anywhere. If there are interests of people which are challenged, or there are domination and exploitation which continues, there's always some kind of a political reaction to that, right? Now, it might be repressed, it might be hard to sustain, it might be hard to organize. India also is a complicated country. It's a continent-sized country. It has different regions and languages and parties. So it's a very unique and complicated country to sort of talk about that, right? But I do like to believe that if we think that popular politics is completely impossible, right, then we are into a very different kind of historical era, and I kind of hope we are not yet there.
Right. On that sobering yet optimistic note, we will conclude this conversation. Thank you, Sudipta, for joining us. It was indeed a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.